The snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets across the remote Colorado mountains, transforming the wilderness into a white tomb that had already claimed too many lives. But on this particular February morning, as rescue teams abandoned their search efforts and declared the missing children lost forever, a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger was about to discover something that would change everything she thought she knew about family, survival, and the true meaning of home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Thompson stood at the window of the Greyhound bus, watching the endless expanse of Montana prairie give way to the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that life rarely offered second chances, and when it did, you took them without asking too many questions. Her worn leather suitcase contained everything she owned in the world: 3 changes of clothes, a Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, $47 in cash, and a collection of letters from a man she had never met, but had agreed to marry. The correspondence. Marriage arrangement had been facilitated through the Prairie Rose Matrimonial Service, a legitimate agency that connected women from economically depressed areas with men in remote regions who needed wives. Rebecca's letters from Thomas Mitchell painted the picture of a successful rancher in Elk Ridge, Colorado, a man who owned 800 acres of prime mountain land and was looking for a partner to help him build something lasting in the wilderness. Rebecca's decision to become a mail-order bride hadn't been made lightly. Growing up in the declining steel town of Youngstown, Ohio, she had watched her father's factory close, her mother succumb to cancer without adequate medical care, and her younger brother Danny struggled with addiction before dying of an overdose at 19. By the time the Prairie Rose advertisement appeared in the local newspaper, Rebecca had been working 3 part-time jobs just to afford rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots were as common as car alarms. Thomas Mitchell's first letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning when Rebecca's landlord was threatening eviction and her cupboards contained nothing but a can of soup and some crackers. His handwriting was neat and precise, his words careful and respectful. He described his ranch as a place where hard work was rewarded and where the right woman could find security, purpose, and eventually love. The photographs he included showed a modest but well-maintained log house surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with outbuildings that suggested a thriving agricultural operation. Over the course of 6 months, their correspondence had developed into something that felt almost like courtship. Thomas wrote about his daily routines caring for cattle and horses, about the challenges of mountain weather and the satisfaction of self-sufficient living. Rebecca shared her dreams of having a garden, of learning to preserve food, of raising children in a place where they could run freely without fear. Neither of them made unrealistic promises about instant romance, but both expressed hope that mutual respect and shared values could grow into something deeper. The bus journey from Ohio to Colorado had taken 3 days, with stops in cities that grew progressively smaller and more isolated as they moved westward. Rebecca had used the travel time to study Thomas's letters one final time, memorizing details about his life and trying to imagine herself as part of his world. She knew he was 34 years old, that he had inherited the ranch from his grandfather, and that he had never been married because the isolation of mountain life made meeting women difficult. What Thomas's letters hadn't mentioned, and what Rebecca was about to discover, was that his ranch sat in the shadow of Mount Torrey's, a peak notorious for sudden weather changes that could trap travelers in deadly avalanche conditions. The local newspaper that Rebecca found abandoned on a bus station bench contained a front page story about 9 children from a church youth group who had been missing for 6 days after their charter van was caught in an unexpected blizzard. During a ski trip to nearby Breckenridge, the search and rescue operation had involved teams from 3 counties, helicopter crews from the National Guard, and volunteer groups that included some of the most experienced mountain climbers in Colorado. Despite their efforts, no trace of the missing van or its young passengers had been found. The children, ranging in age from 8 to 16, were presumed dead by authorities who understood the impossibility of surviving a week in sub-zero temperatures without adequate shelter or supplies. Rebecca's bus pulled into the Elk Ridge station, just as the local sheriff was giving a press conference about the suspended search efforts. The small crowd gathered around the television in the station's waiting area included several men whose weathered faces and work clothes suggested they were ranchers and loggers from the surrounding area. Their expressions reflected the particular grief that comes from losing children in a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else's families. Thomas Mitchell was supposed to meet Rebecca at the bus station, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, she began to worry that something had gone wrong. The station attendant, an elderly man named Frank, who seemed to know every resident within 50 miles, made several phone calls to the Mitchell Ranch without receiving an answer. His growing concern was evident as he explained that Thomas was known for his reliability and would never leave someone stranded without a very good reason. As evening approached and the temperature began dropping toward dangerous levels, Frank insisted that Rebecca couldn't spend the night in the unheated bus station. He offered to drive her to the Mitchell Ranch himself, using his ancient pickup truck that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, but proved surprisingly capable on the treacherous mountain roads. The journey took them through terrain that seemed almost alien to someone accustomed to Ohio's gentle hills and industrial landscapes. The Mitchell Ranch house sat in a valley surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to close in on them as darkness fell. The property showed signs of careful maintenance, with fenced pastures and outbuildings that suggested a successful operation. But something felt wrong as they approached the main house. No lights were visible in the windows, no smoke rose from the chimney, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the pine trees. Frank's calls to the house went unanswered, and when he tried the front door, they discovered it was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal except for the cold temperature that indicated the heating system hadn't been running for several days. A note on the kitchen table, written in Thomas's careful handwriting, explained that he had joined the search and rescue operation for the missing children and expected to return within 48 hours. The note was dated 5 days earlier. Frank's expression grew increasingly grave as he read the message and calculated the timeline. Thomas had been missing for 3 days longer than expected, which meant he was likely caught in the same storm system that had claimed the children. The search and rescue teams had already declared the operation too dangerous to continue, which meant Thomas was on his own in conditions that had already proven fatal to others. Rebecca found herself in an impossible situation, stranded in a remote location with a man she had traveled across the country to marry, who was now missing and possibly dead, leaving her with no resources, no transportation, and no clear path forward. The nearest town was 20 miles away over mountain roads that became impassable during winter storms. Frank offered to take her back to Elk Ridge, but his old truck was already struggling with the deteriorating weather conditions. The decision was made for them when the wind picked up and snow began falling with the intensity that locals recognized as the beginning of a serious storm. Frank's truck barely made it back to the ranch house before visibility dropped to near zero and the roads became completely impassable. They were trapped together in a house that belonged to a missing man, with limited food supplies and a heating system that Rebecca didn't know how to operate. Frank proved to be a capable companion in crisis, quickly assessing their situation and taking charge of the practical necessities for survival. He restarted the heating system, checked the food stores, and inventoried the emergency supplies that Thomas had wisely accumulated for exactly this type of situation. The ranch house was well prepared for isolation, with a generator, stored fuel, preserved food, and enough firewood to last several weeks. As the storm raged outside and they settled in for what would clearly be an extended stay, Frank began sharing what he knew about Thomas Mitchell and the broader community that Rebecca had hoped to join. The missing rancher was respected throughout the region for his knowledge of mountain conditions and his willingness to help neighbors in crisis. His decision to join the search for the missing children was consistent with his character. It also suggested that he had put their welfare above his own safety. The missing children belonged to families from Denver's First Baptist Church, Frank explained, and their youth group had been traveling to a ski resort when the storm hit. The van's driver was an experienced mountain traveler, but even locals could be caught off guard by the rapid weather changes that made the Colorado Rockies so dangerous during winter months. The children's families were maintaining a vigil at the command center in Elk Ridge, refusing to accept that their sons and daughters were gone. Rebecca listened to these details while trying to process her own situation and plan for an uncertain future. She had burned her bridges in Ohio, spending her last savings on the bus ticket and giving up her apartment before leaving. There was no going back, even if she could figure out how to get there. Her fate was now tied to this remote valley and whatever remained of Thomas Mitchell's life and property. The storm continued through the night, with winds that shook the sturdy log house and snow that accumulated against the windows in drifts that blocked most of the natural light. Rebecca and Frank took turns, maintaining the fire and monitoring the weather radio for updates on conditions and search operations. The official word remained the same: all search efforts had been suspended indefinitely due to dangerous conditions. Morning brought no improvement in the weather, but it did bring a discovery that would change everything. While searching Thomas's desk for information about local emergency contacts, Rebecca found detailed topographical maps of the surrounding area marked with notes about avalanche patterns, animal trails, and remote cabins that could provide emergency shelter. One location, circled in red ink and labeled Emergency Cache, check regularly, was located approximately 3 miles northeast of the ranch house in an area that seemed particularly isolated. Frank studied the map with the expertise of someone who had lived in the mountains for 70 years, noting the terrain features and calculating the difficulty of reaching the marked location. The cabin was situated in a valley that would provide some protection from wind, but was also prone to avalanche activity from the surrounding slopes. It was exactly the kind of place where experienced mountain travelers might seek shelter during an unexpected storm. The implications were clear but unspoken. If Thomas had been caught in the same storm that trapped the children, he might have guided them to this emergency shelter rather than attempting to reach more distant locations. The cabin could be their salvation or their tomb, depending on whether they had adequate supplies and whether rescue efforts could reach them before starvation or hypothermia claimed their lives. Rebecca found herself at a crossroads that would define not only her immediate future, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. She could wait safely in the ranch house for the storm to pass and for official search efforts to resume, preserving her own safety, while accepting that Thomas and the children were likely beyond help. Or she could risk everything on the possibility that her arrival in this remote valley was not a coincidence, but a calling to save lives that others had given up for lost. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitability that had been building since the moment she first read Thomas's letter describing his mountain home and his dreams of building something meaningful in the wilderness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm broke on the third morning with the sudden clarity that only comes in high mountain country, revealing a landscape transformed into something that belonged more to fairy tales than reality. Snow had accumulated in drifts that reached the second-story windows of the ranch house, and the silence was so complete that Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat as she stood at the kitchen window, Studying the marked location on Thomas's map. Frank had spent the early morning hours checking the ranch's emergency equipment, assembling a collection of gear that would be necessary for any attempt to reach the remote cabin. Snowshoes, emergency rations, first aid supplies, rope, and a portable radio that might allow communication with rescue authorities if they could reach higher elevation. His weathered hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had survived 7 decades of mountain winters, but his eyes held the wariness of a man who understood exactly how many things could go wrong in the wilderness. "That cabin's in prime avalanche territory," Frank said, spreading the topographical map across the kitchen table and tracing potential routes with his finger. "Thomas marked it for a reason, but getting there means crossing 3 separate slide zones, 1 loud noise, 1 unstable snow layer, and you're buried under tons of snow with no chance of digging out." Rebecca studied the terrain features Frank was pointing out, trying to understand the deadly geometry of slopes and snowpack that could turn a rescue mission into a suicide attempt. She had grown up in flat Ohio countryside where the most dangerous weather was summer thunderstorms and winter ice on the roads. The concept of mountains that could literally bury you alive was beyond her experience, but she was learning quickly that survival in this environment required respecting forces far beyond human control. The radio crackled with intermittent transmissions from the Search Command Center in Elk Ridge, where officials were assessing whether conditions had improved enough to resume limited rescue operations. The reports were not encouraging. While the immediate storm had passed, the snow conditions remained unstable and the avalanche danger was rated as extreme throughout the region. Professional rescue teams were grounded until further notice. "We could wait for the authorities," Frank said, but his tone suggested he knew that waiting meant accepting the deaths of anyone who might still be alive in the mountains. "Give it another week for conditions to stabilize. Let the experts handle it with proper equipment and training." Rebecca felt the weight of that decision settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. A week meant that Thomas and the missing children would almost certainly be dead from exposure or starvation if they weren't already. But attempting a rescue with limited experience and inadequate equipment could easily result in more deaths, including her own. The rational choice was clear, but something deep in her core rebelled against the idea of staying safe while others died within reach of help. How long would it take to reach the cabin? She asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Frank's expression grew more serious as he calculated distances and terrain difficulties. "In good conditions, maybe 4 hours. In these snow conditions, with avalanche danger and no established trail, could be 8 to 10 hours if we make it at all. That's assuming the weather holds and we don't get caught in another storm front." The implications were sobering. A round trip would require at least 16 hours of travel time in dangerous conditions, with no guarantee of finding anything at their destination except another empty building. If they encountered problems along the way, if the weather changed, if they triggered an avalanche or became lost in the unmarked wilderness, they would join the list of people who needed rescuing rather than providing rescue for others. Rebecca walked to the window again, looking out at the pristine snow that covered everything in deceptive beauty. Somewhere out there, 9 children might be huddled together in a cabin, rationing whatever food they had managed to salvage from their van, burning furniture to stay warm, and wondering if anyone was still looking for them. The oldest was 16, old enough to take responsibility for the younger ones, but still a child himself facing an impossible situation. Her decision crystallized with sudden clarity that surprised her. "I'm going," she said, turning back to Frank with a determination that came from somewhere deeper than logic or self-preservation. "I didn't come this far to sit in a warm house while children die in the mountains." Frank studied her with the appraising look of someone evaluating whether a partner would be an asset or a liability in a life-threatening situation. Rebecca was clearly inexperienced in mountain survival, but she was also physically fit from years of manual labor, mentally tough from surviving difficult circumstances, and motivated by the kind of protective instinct that could drive people beyond their normal limitations. "If we do this, we do it right," Frank said finally. "Full winter gear, emergency bivouac equipment, enough supplies for 3 days in case we get trapped. We move slow and careful, test every slope before crossing, and turn back at the first sign of dangerous conditions. This isn't about heroics. It's about giving those kids the best chance we can without throwing our lives away." The preparation took 2 hours, with Frank methodically checking every piece of equipment while explaining its purpose and proper use to Rebecca. The snowshoes were essential for traveling over deep snow without sinking, but they also required a modified walking technique that could be exhausting for inexperienced users. The avalanche beacons would help rescue teams locate their bodies if they were buried, but provided no protection against the crushing force of moving snow. Rebecca learned to use the emergency radio, to recognize signs of hypothermia and altitude sickness, and to estimate travel time based on terrain difficulty and weather conditions. Frank's instruction was thorough and patient, but he also made it clear that mistakes in the mountains were often fatal and that her life would depend on following his guidance without question or hesitation. The journey began just after noon, with both travelers carrying heavy packs loaded with emergency supplies and rescue equipment. The first mile was relatively easy, following fence lines and familiar landmarks through Thomas's ranch property, but the difficulty increased dramatically once they entered the unmarked wilderness beyond the property boundaries. Moving on snowshoes required constant attention to balance and footing, especially when crossing uneven terrain or navigating around obstacles like fallen trees and rock outcroppings. Rebecca's leg muscles burned from the unfamiliar motion, and the thin mountain air left her breathing heavily despite the moderate pace that Frank maintained. The altitude at the ranch house was already over 8,000 feet, and they were climbing steadily toward even higher elevations where oxygen levels would be significantly reduced. Frank stopped frequently to assess avalanche conditions, examining snow layers and slope angles with the expertise of someone who had learned to read the mountain's moods through decades of experience. He pointed out subtle signs that Rebecca would have missed: the way wind patterns had loaded snow on certain slopes, the hollow sound that indicated unstable layers beneath the surface, the telltale cracks that appeared when weight was applied to questionable areas. "Mountains will kill you if you're not paying attention," Frank explained during one of their rest stops. "But they'll also warn you first if you know how to listen. The snow talks to you, tells you what it's planning to do. The trick is learning the language before it's too late to matter." As they climbed higher, the landscape became increasingly alien and beautiful. Massive pine trees were bent and twisted by the constant wind, their branches heavy with snow that created natural sculptures of impossible delicacy. The silence was broken only by the sound of their snowshoes crunching through the snow and the occasional crack of a tree adjusting to temperature changes. The first major test came at a steep slope that offered 2 possible routes: a direct path up the face that would save time but cross directly through an avalanche zone, or a longer route that followed a ridgeline but would add several hours to their journey. Frank studied both options carefully, probing snow conditions and evaluating the risk factors that could trigger a deadly slide. "We take the ridge," he decided. "It's longer, but it keeps us off the loaded slopes. Those children have been waiting 6 days. They can wait a few more hours if it means we actually reach them alive." The ridge route proved exhausting, requiring them to traverse steep terrain while maintaining elevation to avoid descending into avalanche-prone valleys. Rebecca's inexperience showed as she struggled with the technical aspects of mountain travel, but her determination kept her moving even when every muscle in her body screamed for rest. As evening approached and shadows began lengthening across the snow, Frank called a halt to check their position and assess whether they could reach the cabin before darkness made further travel impossible. Mountain navigation in winter required constant attention to landmarks and terrain features, since familiar trails disappeared under snow and whiteout conditions could make even experienced travelers lose their way completely. "We're about a mile out," Frank announced after studying the map and comparing it to visible peaks around them. "But that's the hardest mile, across open slopes and through a narrow canyon that funnels wind like a wind tunnel. If we're going to find trouble, it'll be in the next hour." Rebecca felt a mixture of anticipation and dread as they resumed their journey toward the cabin location. Every step brought them closer to answers about Thomas's fate and the missing children, but also deeper into terrain where rescue would be impossible if something went wrong. The weight of responsibility for their decision pressed down on her like the growing darkness around them. The final approach to the cabin proved to be the most dangerous part of their journey. The building was located in a narrow valley that required crossing two steep slopes where recent wind activity had created unstable snow conditions. Frank went first, testing each step and looking for signs of shifting or settling that would indicate imminent avalanche danger. What they found when they finally reached the cabin would challenge everything Rebecca thought she knew about survival, responsibility, and the lengths people would go to protect those they loved. The small structure sat partially buried in snowdrifts, with only the roof and upper windows visible above the accumulated precipitation. But from one of those windows, a faint light flickered in the gathering darkness and the smoke rising from a makeshift chimney proved that someone inside was still alive. The discovery that followed would test Rebecca's resolve and transform her understanding of what it truly meant to build a family from nothing in the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado mountains. The approach to the buried cabin required careful navigation through snowdrifts that reached nearly to the roofline, creating an otherworldly landscape where the normal rules of architecture and access no longer applied. Frank tested each step with his ski pole, probing for hidden obstacles and unstable snow layers that could collapse without warning. The faint light flickering in the upper window grew brighter as they drew closer, revealing itself to be a small candle or oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the frost-covered glass. Rebecca's heart pounded with a mixture of hope and terror as she realized they were about to encounter survivors of an ordeal that had lasted 6 days in conditions that should have been fatal. The implications were staggering. If people were alive in the cabin, they would likely be in critical condition from cold, hunger, and possibly injury sustained during whatever catastrophe had brought them to this remote location. Frank reached the partially buried door first, brushing away accumulated snow to reveal a heavy wooden barrier that had been reinforced from the inside with what appeared to be furniture and other materials. The sound of their approach had not gone unnoticed. Muffled voices could be heard from within, urgent and frightened, as the occupants tried to determine whether the newcomers represented rescue or additional danger. "Hello in there," Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "We're here to help. Is anyone injured?" The response came immediately, a young voice, cracking with emotion and exhaustion, shouting through the makeshift barricade. "Please help us. We have little kids here, and they're really sick. Please don't leave us." Rebecca felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized they had found the missing children from Denver's First Baptist Church. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by the sobering understanding that finding them was only the beginning of their challenges. Getting 9 children out of a buried cabin and across miles of dangerous mountain terrain would test every resource they possessed. Frank began the delicate process of clearing snow from around the door while maintaining the structural integrity of the drifts that were actually helping to insulate the cabin. Too much digging could destabilize the entire snow load and cause a collapse that would trap everyone inside. The work was slow and methodical, requiring constant assessment of snow conditions and careful removal of only the material that was absolutely necessary for access. As the door became accessible, Rebecca could hear more voices from inside, children of various ages, some crying, others trying to maintain calm despite circumstances that would challenge experienced adults. The oldest voice, which she assumed belonged to the 16-year-old leader mentioned in news reports, was attempting to organize the group and prepare them for whatever was about to happen. "We're going to move some of the furniture away." From the door, the teenage voice announced, "Everyone stay back and keep the little ones warm. Help might actually be here this time." The phrase "this time" caught Rebecca's attention, suggesting that the children had experienced false hope before, possibly hearing search helicopters or other sounds that had raised their expectations of rescue, only to disappear again. The psychological impact of repeated disappointments, combined with physical stress and fear, would have pushed even the strongest children toward their breaking point. When the door finally opened, the scene that greeted Rebecca exceeded her worst expectations. 9 children, ranging in age from 8 to 16, were huddled together in a space that reeked of unwashed bodies, improvised waste management, and the smoke from furniture they had burned to stay warm. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces gaunt from inadequate nutrition, and several of the younger ones appeared to be suffering from hypothermia, despite the older children's efforts to keep them warm. The teenager who had been speaking was Michael Harrison, a tall, lanky boy whose maturity had been forced upon him by circumstances no 16-year-old should have to face. His leadership of the group was evident in the way the other children looked to him for guidance and the organized manner in which they had arranged their limited resources. Despite his own obvious exhaustion and stress, Michael's first concern was for the younger children in his care. "Sarah and Tommy are the worst," Michael said, gesturing toward 2 children who lay motionless under a collection of coats and blankets. "They stopped shivering yesterday, and we can't get them to wake up all the way. Jessica hurt her leg when we were getting out of the van, and Marcus has been coughing up blood since the 2nd day." Rebecca knelt beside the unconscious children, her limited first aid training allowing her to recognize the advanced stages of hypothermia that could prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. Their skin was pale and waxy, their breathing shallow and irregular, and their core body temperatures had dropped to dangerously low levels. Frank immediately began unpacking emergency heating supplies while Rebecca assessed the extent of injuries and illnesses among the group. The story that emerged from Michael and the other children painted a picture of resourcefulness and courage that was remarkable considering their ages and circumstances. Their church van had been caught in the blizzard while returning from a ski trip, sliding off the mountain road and becoming trapped in a gully where it was quickly buried by accumulating snow. The driver, Mr. Peterson, had been killed in the initial crash, leaving the children to fend for themselves in an impossible situation. Michael had remembered stories about emergency shelters in the mountains and had led the group through chest-deep snow to reach the cabin, carrying the injured children and salvaging whatever supplies they could from the wrecked van. His knowledge came from Boy Scout training and adventure books, hardly adequate preparation for a real survival situation, but it had kept them alive long enough for rescue to arrive. The cabin itself was a basic emergency shelter maintained by the Forest Service, stocked with minimal supplies that the children had stretched far beyond their intended duration. They had rationed their food carefully, melted snow for drinking water, and burned furniture to maintain a small fire that provided both warmth and the psychological comfort of light in the overwhelming darkness of their situation. "We kept thinking someone would find us," explained Jennifer Walsh, a 14-year-old who had helped Michael organize the younger children. "We could hear helicopters sometimes, but they never came close enough." After the 4th day, some of the kids stopped believing anyone was looking for us. The children's physical condition varied significantly based on their ages and how well they had tolerated the extreme conditions. The older children, like Michael and Jennifer, showed signs of exhaustion and malnutrition, but remained functional and alert. The middle group, ranging from 10 to 13, were weakened but responsive to stimulus and able to communicate effectively about their needs and experiences. It was the youngest children who presented the most critical medical challenges. 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell and 9-year-old Tommy Rodriguez had both progressed to advanced hypothermia and showed signs of dehydration and possible pneumonia. 10-year-old Jessica Chun was unable to walk due to what appeared to be a fractured leg that had been splinted with makeshift materials but required professional medical treatment. Frank's emergency medical training, gained through decades of ranch work and mountain rescue volunteering, allowed him to begin addressing the most immediate threats to the children's survival. He initiated rewarming procedures for the hypothermic children, using body heat, warm liquids, and insulation techniques that could gradually raise their core temperatures without causing dangerous cardiac complications. Rebecca found herself serving as both assistant medic and psychological counselor as the children gradually began to trust that rescue was real and not another cruel false hope. Her natural maternal instincts, never before tested in such extreme circumstances, emerged with surprising strength as she comforted frightened children while helping Frank provide medical care. The practical challenges of evacuation became apparent as Frank assessed the children's conditions and the available transportation options. Several children were too weak to walk the 3 miles back to the ranch house, especially through deep snow and difficult terrain. The weather remained unstable, with new storm systems visible on the horizon that could trap the entire group in the cabin if they delayed too long. "We can't move them all at once," Frank concluded after examining each child and considering the available resources. "The little ones won't survive the trip in their current condition, and we don't have enough emergency equipment to keep everyone warm if we get caught in another storm." The decision they faced was agonizing: attempt to evacuate all 9 children immediately and risk losing some of them to exposure during the journey, or leave some behind while making multiple trips. That would extend their time in the mountains and increase the chances of being trapped by weather. Either choice carried substantial risks, but the deteriorating condition of the youngest children made delay increasingly dangerous. Rebecca studied the faces of the children who had survived 6 days of hell through courage, cooperation, and sheer determination. They had placed their trust in her and Frank, believing that adults would somehow solve problems that seemed impossible to adult eyes. The weight of their faith was both inspiring and terrifying as she realized that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine whether their rescue story ended in triumph or tragedy. Michael Harrison, the teenage leader who had kept them alive through the longest week of their young lives, looked directly at Rebecca with eyes that had aged years in less than a week. "Whatever you decide, we trust you," he said simply. "You came for us when everyone else gave up. That's all that matters." The evacuation plan that followed would test every skill, resource, and ounce of determination that Rebecca and Frank possessed, while the children they had discovered would prove that survival was only the beginning of their journey back to the world they had left behind. The evacuation strategy that Frank and Rebecca developed required splitting the group into 2 phases, based on the children's medical conditions and ability to travel. The first group would consist of the 5 children who were mobile and stable enough to make the journey immediately, while the second group would include the 4 most critically ill children who needed additional medical stabilization before attempting the dangerous trek back to the ranch house. Rebecca volunteered to lead the first group while Frank remained behind to continue treating the hypothermic children and prepare them for evacuation. The decision meant separating their limited resources and expertise, leaving each of them responsible for life and death decisions without the other's support. It was a calculated risk based on the understanding that delay posed a greater threat than the dangers of splitting up. Michael Harrison would accompany Rebecca's group, serving as both a mobile patient who needed medical attention for his own exhaustion and malnutrition, and as a leader who could help manage the younger children. During the difficult journey, his knowledge of the other children's personalities, fears, and capabilities would be invaluable in keeping the group together and motivated during the grueling trek through mountain wilderness. The first evacuation group consisted of Michael, Jennifer Walsh, 14-year-old David Chun, Jessica's brother, 12-year-old Amanda Rodriguez, Tommy's sister, and 11-year-old Kevin Mitchell, Sarah's brother. Each child carried emotional burdens beyond their physical challenges. David was consumed with guilt about leaving his injured sister behind. Amanda was terrified that her unconscious brother might die while she was gone, and Kevin struggled with the fear that he would never see Sarah alive again. Rebecca's preparation for leading the group revealed how much she had learned about mountain survival in just a few hours of intensive education from Frank. She carefully distributed emergency supplies among the children who were capable of carrying them, ensuring that each person had access to food, water, and warming materials without being overburdened by weight that would slow their progress or exhaust them dangerously. The psychological preparation proved as important as the physical logistics. Rebecca gathered the 5 children together and explained the journey ahead in terms that acknowledged the real dangers while maintaining their confidence in a successful outcome. Her approach balanced honesty about the challenges they would face with reassurance that they had already survived the worst part of their ordeal. "We're going to take this slow and steady," Rebecca told them, kneeling so she could make eye contact with each child. "The mountains are dangerous, but they're also beautiful, and we're going to see some amazing things on our way home. Most importantly, we're going to do this together, and nobody gets left behind." The departure from the cabin was emotionally wrenching for all involved. The children leaving had to say goodbye to friends who might not survive until the rescue team could return, while those staying behind faced additional hours of uncertainty and fear. Frank worked to reassure both groups that separation was temporary and necessary, but his own expression reflected the weight of responsibility he felt for the children remaining in his care. Rebecca's group began their journey in the late afternoon, with approximately 4 hours of daylight remaining for travel. The route back to the ranch house would be longer and more difficult than the morning's approach, since they now needed to account for the slower pace of exhausted children and the additional safety precautions required when traveling with a group rather than 2 experienced adults. The initial mile proved to be a revealing test of each child's capabilities and limitations. Michael, despite his leadership qualities and determination, showed signs of severe exhaustion that required frequent rest stops and assistance with navigation. Jennifer demonstrated remarkable resilience and maturity, helping the younger children with their snowshoes and providing emotional support when fear or fatigue threatened to overwhelm them. David Chun emerged as the group's most challenging member, not due to physical limitations, but because of his emotional state regarding his sister Jessica's condition. His guilt about leaving her behind manifested as reckless behavior and attempts to return to the cabin, requiring constant supervision and reassurance from Rebecca and the older children. Amanda Rodriguez proved to be surprisingly capable despite her small size and obvious exhaustion. Her concern for her unconscious brother Tommy motivated her to push beyond her normal limits, and her positive attitude helped maintain group morale during the most difficult parts of the journey. Kevin Mitchell, the youngest member of the evacuation group, required the most assistance with technical aspects of mountain travel, but showed remarkable courage for an 11-year-old facing circumstances that would challenge most adults. First major crisis occurred when the group reached the steep slope that Frank had identified as the most dangerous avalanche zone during their morning approach. The snow conditions had changed throughout the day as temperatures fluctuated and wind patterns shifted, creating new instabilities that required careful assessment before attempting to cross. Rebecca found herself drawing on knowledge she had gained only hours earlier. testing snow layers and evaluating slope angles with techniques that Frank had demonstrated during their ascent. The responsibility for making decisions that could trigger an avalanche and kill all 5 children was overwhelming, but the alternative of turning back or finding a different route would mean spending the night in the mountains without adequate shelter or supplies. The crossing required the children to move in single file, maintaining significant spacing between individuals to minimize the load on any particular section of snow. Rebecca went first, testing each step and marking a safe route for the children to follow, while Michael brought up the rear to ensure that no one fell behind or became separated from the group. Halfway across the slope, David Chun's emotional state finally overwhelmed his judgment. Overcome by guilt and fear about his sister's condition, he attempted to break away from the group and return to the cabin, convinced that Jessica needed him more than his own safety mattered. His sudden movement off the established route triggered a small avalanche that sent a wall of snow cascading down the mountainside. The avalanche was relatively minor by mountain standards, but it was large enough to knock David off his feet and bury him under several feet of moving snow. Rebecca's response was immediate and professional. Using avalanche rescue techniques that Frank had taught her to locate David's position and begin digging him out before hypothermia or suffocation could claim his life, the rescue effort required all 5 remaining group members working together with their emergency shovels and probes to locate David and extract him from the snow burial. The process took 20 minutes of frantic digging, during which Rebecca had to maintain calm and organization, while privately fearing that they were already too late to save the boy's life. When they finally uncovered David, he was unconscious and blue from lack of oxygen, requiring immediate resuscitation efforts that tested Rebecca's limited medical training. The CPR technique she had learned years earlier in a basic first aid class proved adequate to restart his breathing, but the incident had consumed precious daylight and emotional energy that the group could not afford to lose. The near-death experience transformed David from a liability into one of the group's most motivated members. His brush with avalanche burial gave him a visceral understanding of the dangers they faced and eliminated his reckless impulses to return to the cabin. More importantly, it demonstrated to all the children that their survival depended on following Rebecca's instructions without question or deviation. The remainder of the journey tested the group's endurance and determination as darkness fell and temperatures dropped toward dangerous levels. Rebecca had to make continuous decisions about rest stops, route selection, and pace management while monitoring each child for signs of hypothermia, exhaustion, or injury that could threaten their survival. Jennifer Walsh proved to be Rebecca's most valuable assistant, helping to manage the younger children's needs and providing emotional support when fear or despair threatened to overwhelm the group. Her maturity and leadership skills complemented Rebecca's authority, creating a stable command structure that gave the children confidence in their eventual rescue. The final mile to the ranch house became a race against time as the children's energy reserves approached complete depletion and weather conditions deteriorated with the setting sun. Rebecca found herself carrying Kevin Mitchell for the last half mile, while Michael and Jennifer helped support Amanda and David through terrain that would have been challenging for healthy adults. When the lights of the ranch house finally appeared through the darkness, the emotional relief was overwhelming for all involved. The children had survived not only 6 days in an emergency shelter, but also a dangerous mountain rescue that had tested their courage and determination beyond anything they had previously experienced. Frank's radio transmission confirming their safe arrival reached the Search Command Center in Elk Ridge, just as official rescue operations were being organized to resume the following morning. The news that 5 of the missing children had been found alive electrified the rescue community and gave new hope to the families who had maintained vigil throughout the week-long ordeal. But Rebecca's mission was only half complete. 4 children remained in the buried cabin with Frank, including the 2 who were fighting for their lives against advanced hypothermia. The second evacuation would require different strategies and greater risks, as the most critically ill children would need to be transported rather than walking under their own power. The race against time had entered its most critical phase, with weather forecasts predicting another major storm system that could trap the remaining rescue team and children for days or weeks in conditions that the injured could not survive. The ranch house buzzed with activity as Rebecca transformed the living room into a makeshift medical facility for the 5 rescued children. Her inexperience with pediatric care was offset by maternal instincts that seemed to emerge fully formed under crisis conditions, guiding her through the complex process of treating exhaustion, dehydration, and mild hypothermia while maintaining the emotional stability that the traumatized children desperately needed. Michael Harrison's condition proved more serious than initially apparent. The 16-year-old's week of leadership responsibility, combined with inadequate nutrition and extreme stress, had pushed his young body beyond its limits. Rebecca discovered that he had been giving most of his food rations to the younger children, while concealing his own deteriorating condition to maintain morale and authority within the group. "I couldn't let them see me weak," Michael admitted as Rebecca helped him out of his frozen clothing. "They needed someone to believe we were going to make it. If I had broken down, they all would have given up." His sacrifice epitomized the extraordinary courage that had kept all 9 children alive through an ordeal that claimed adult lives in similar circumstances. Rebecca felt a deep respect for the young man who had shouldered responsibilities far beyond his years while maintaining the hope and determination that proved essential for group survival. The radio communication with Frank at the cabin painted an increasingly urgent picture of the remaining children's conditions. Sarah Mitchell and Tommy Rodriguez had not regained consciousness, and their core body temperatures continued to drop despite Frank's aggressive rewarming efforts. Jessica Chen's leg injury showed signs of infection that could become life-threatening without proper medical treatment, while 8-year-old Marcus Williams was developing pneumonia symptoms that made every breath a struggle. Weather reports from the National Weather Service confirmed Rebecca's worst fears about the window of opportunity for the second rescue mission. A massive storm system was moving across the Rocky Mountains, bringing winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and snowfall rates that could dump 3 feet of new accumulation in less than 12 hours. The system was expected to reach their area by dawn, effectively ending any possibility of evacuation for at least a week. "We have maybe 6 hours before conditions become impossible," Rebecca told the rescued children as she prepared for the return journey. "I need to go back for your friends, but I need you to be strong and take care of each other while I'm gone." The decision to make the second rescue attempt alone was controversial but necessary. Frank's medical expertise was essential for keeping the critically ill children alive at the cabin, and the rescued children at the ranch house needed supervision and continued care. Rebecca would have to handle the technical aspects of evacuation, while Frank managed the medical emergencies, leaving both of them without backup in life-threatening situations. Jennifer Walsh volunteered to accompany Rebecca on the return journey, arguing that her knowledge of the remaining children's conditions and personalities would be valuable during the evacuation. Her courage was admirable, but Rebecca gently refused, recognizing that the 14-year-old had already endured more trauma than most adults experience in a lifetime. "Your job now is to help Michael take care of the others," Rebecca explained. "They're going to need strong leaders here while the adults are gone. That's just as important as anything I'm doing in the mountains." The preparation for the second rescue required different equipment and strategies than the first evacuation. Rebecca assembled a makeshift sledge using materials from Thomas's workshop, creating a transport system that would allow her to move unconscious children across snow-covered terrain. The device was crude but functional, designed for durability rather than comfort in conditions where mechanical failure could mean death for everyone involved. Emergency medical supplies took priority. over personal comfort items as Rebecca packed for what would likely be the most dangerous night of her life. Oxygen supplies for treating altitude sickness, 4 fluids for severe dehydration, warming blankets designed for hypothermia treatment, and pain medications that could keep injured children conscious and cooperative during the evacuation process. Journey back to the cabin was a race against time, conducted in deteriorating weather conditions that made navigation increasingly difficult. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to near zero in some areas, forcing Rebecca to rely on compass headings and terrain features that were becoming obscured by the approaching storm. The temperature dropped steadily as she climbed toward higher elevations, creating ice layers that made footing treacherous, even with proper equipment. Frank's radio updates provided a grim countdown of the children's declining conditions. Sarah Mitchell's breathing had become irregular and shallow, suggesting that her hypothermia was progressing toward the final stages that preceded cardiac arrest. Tommy Rodriguez showed no response to external stimuli, and his skin temperature indicated that his body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core vital organs. Jessica Chun remained conscious but was experiencing severe pain from her infected leg wound, while Marcus Williams was struggling with breathing difficulties that suggested his pneumonia was worsening rapidly. Frank's medical training allowed him to provide supportive care, but definitive treatment required resources and facilities that existed only in hospital settings. "How much time do we have?" Rebecca asked during one of their radio contacts, her voice barely audible over the increasing wind noise. "Sarah and Tommy need to be in a hospital within 4 hours, or we're going to lose them," Frank replied with the brutal honesty that the situation demanded. "Jessica and Marcus might last longer, but not much. The infection is spreading, and the pneumonia is getting worse by the hour." The final approach to the cabin required Rebecca to navigate through snowdrifts that had grown significantly since her departure, evidence of the storm's advancing edge, and a preview of conditions that would soon make travel impossible. The structure was almost completely buried now, with only the chimney and a small section of roof visible above the accumulated snow. Frank met her at the entrance with a medical briefing that confirmed her worst fears about the children's conditions. The unconscious children showed minimal vital signs, their bodies conserving energy for basic survival functions, while their core temperatures hovered dangerously close to levels that would trigger irreversible cardiac complications. "We have to move them now," Frank announced, his usual calm demeanor strained by hours of watching children fight for their lives. "Any delay means we're just going to be transporting bodies instead of patients." The evacuation of unconscious children presented technical challenges that tested every skill Rebecca had learned during her brief mountain education. Each child had to be secured to the makeshift sledge in a way that protected their injuries, while allowing for medical monitoring during transport. The process required constant attention to airway management, body temperature regulation, and vital sign assessment while maintaining forward progress through increasingly dangerous terrain. Marcus Williams, despite his pneumonia symptoms, remained conscious and able to assist with his own evacuation. His courage impressed both adults as he struggled to breathe while helping them secure the other children and organize the limited supplies they could carry during the emergency exodus from the cabin. Jessica Chun's condition had deteriorated significantly during Rebecca's absence, but her determination to reunite with her brother David gave her strength that exceeded her physical capabilities. Frank's emergency splinting had stabilized her leg fracture, but the infection required immediate antibiotic treatment that was not available in their wilderness setting. The sledge transport system worked better than expected for the first mile of evacuation, allowing them to maintain reasonable progress while providing a stable platform for medical care during the journey. Frank walked alongside the unconscious children, monitoring their conditions and making adjustments to their positioning and insulation as needed. Rebecca served as the primary navigator and power source for the sledge, using techniques learned From Frank's instruction to read terrain features and avoid dangerous slopes or unstable snow conditions. The weight of 4 children plus medical equipment made progress exhausting, but the alternative of making multiple trips was eliminated by the deteriorating weather conditions. The storm's arrival transformed their rescue mission into a survival situation that challenged every assumption about what was possible in mountain wilderness conditions. Wind speeds increased to levels that made communication impossible without shouting, while snow accumulation began erasing their tracks within minutes of passage. Navigation became a matter of dead reckoning and intuition as familiar landmarks disappeared under the storm's fury. Rebecca found herself relying on instincts she didn't know she possessed, making route decisions based on subtle changes in wind patterns and terrain features that remained visible only to someone who had learned to read the mountains' moods. Final 2 miles to the ranch house became an endurance test that pushed all 3 conscious members of the group beyond their normal limits. Frank's medical expertise was essential for keeping the unconscious children alive during transport, while Rebecca's determination provided the physical strength needed to move the heavy sledge through increasingly deep snow. Marcus Williams collapsed during the final mile, his pneumonia symptoms overwhelming his respiratory system and forcing Frank to make the difficult decision to divide his attention between multiple critical patients. The 8-year-old's breathing became labored and irregular, requiring emergency intervention that Frank provided while Rebecca continued pulling the sledge toward safety. When the lights of the ranch house finally became visible through the storm, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that they had reached safety with only hours to spare before conditions became impossible for evacuation. The children's survival had been measured in minutes rather than days, and several would require immediate helicopter evacuation to advanced medical facilities if they were to have any chance of full recovery. The reunion of the 2 groups was emotional beyond description, as siblings and friends who had faced death together were finally reunited in the safety of the ranch house. But Rebecca knew that their ordeal was far from over, and the real challenge of rehabilitation and recovery was just beginning for 9 children, who had been forever changed by their week in the wilderness. The ranch house became a battlefield between life and death as Rebecca and Frank worked desperately to stabilize 9 children whose medical conditions ranged from severe exhaustion to life-threatening hypothermia. The living room had been transformed into an emergency medical facility that would have challenged a fully equipped hospital, requiring improvised solutions for problems that typically demanded sophisticated equipment and specialized expertise. Sarah Mitchell lay unconscious on the couch closest to the fireplace, her 8-year-old body fighting a losing battle against hypothermia that had progressed to dangerous levels during the final hours at the cabin. Frank worked over her with the intensity of a trauma surgeon, using every technique he had learned during decades of ranch emergencies and volunteer rescue work to gradually raise her core temperature without triggering cardiac complications. Rewarming process required delicate balance between aggressive intervention and patient safety. Too rapid an increase in body temperature could cause dangerous shifts in blood pressure and heart rhythm, while insufficient warming would allow the hypothermia to progress to irreversible organ failure. Frank monitored Sarah's vital signs constantly, adjusting heat sources and insulation based on subtle changes in her breathing patterns and skin color. Tommy Rodriguez presented an even more critical challenge, having slipped into a coma-like state that suggested severe brain complications from prolonged cold exposure. His 9-year-old body showed minimal response to external stimuli, and his breathing had become so shallow that Frank had to check repeatedly to confirm he was still alive. The boy's survival would depend on interventions that exceeded the capabilities of their improvised medical facility. Rebecca found herself serving as both nurse and coordinator, moving between children to assist with medical procedures while maintaining communication with emergency services that were struggling to organize. helicopter evacuations in increasingly dangerous weather conditions. The storm that had nearly trapped them at the cabin was now preventing professional medical teams from reaching the ranch, creating a situation where lives hung in the balance of weather patterns beyond human control. Jessica Chun's infected leg wound required immediate attention that tested the limits of Frank's field medicine experience. The injury had developed into a serious bacterial infection that was spreading through her system, causing fever and delirium that made medical treatment difficult and dangerous. Frank's emergency antibiotic supplies were limited to basic medications. That might slow the infection's progress, but could not provide the definitive treatment that Jessica needed to survive. "The infection is moving into her bloodstream," Frank explained to Rebecca as he cleaned and redressed Jessica's wound. "Without 4 antibiotics and proper surgical debridement, we're looking at sepsis within 12 to 18 hours. She needs to be in an operating room, not a ranch house living room." Marcus Williams struggled with pneumonia symptoms that had worsened significantly during the evacuation. His breathing labored and painful as fluid accumulated in his lungs. The 8-year-old's condition was complicated by exhaustion and dehydration that made his respiratory system less capable of fighting the infection. Frank's treatment options were limited to supportive care that could ease Marcus's suffering but not address the underlying medical emergency. The 5 children from the first evacuation group required less intensive medical intervention but still needed careful monitoring for complications that could emerge hours or days after their rescue. Michael Harrison's exhaustion was more severe than initially apparent, his body having depleted essential nutrients and electrolytes during his week of leadership responsibility and self-sacrifice. Jennifer Walsh showed signs of delayed shock reaction, her remarkable composure during the crisis beginning to crack as the reality of their survival settled into her consciousness. The 14-year-old's emotional state was fragile, requiring gentle psychological support, while her body recovered from the physical stresses of prolonged cold exposure and inadequate nutrition. David Chun's guilt about his sister Jessica's condition manifested as hypervigilance and anxiety that made rest impossible despite his obvious exhaustion. He remained constantly at Jessica's side, holding her hand and talking to her during periods when fever made her delirious and frightened. His emotional attachment was touching, but also complicated medical treatment efforts that required space and calm around the patient. Amanda Rodriguez and Kevin Mitchell, the youngest members of the first evacuation group, displayed the resilience that children often demonstrate in crisis situations, bouncing back from their ordeal with remarkable speed while still requiring careful monitoring for delayed reactions. Their energy and optimism provided emotional support for the older children who were struggling with more complex psychological responses to trauma. The emergency radio communications with Elk Ridge revealed the full scope of the logistical challenges facing professional rescue teams. The storm had grounded all helicopter operations and made road access to the ranch impossible for conventional emergency vehicles. Specialized snow rescue teams were being assembled, but their arrival would be delayed by several hours while equipment was gathered and transportation arranged. "We're doing everything we can to reach you," the emergency coordinator reported during one of their radio contacts. "But we need the wind to drop below 30 miles per hour before we can get helicopters in the air, and the road crews are working around the clock to clear access routes. Can you maintain the patient's conditions for another 6 to 8 hours?" Frank's response was carefully worded to avoid creating panic among the children who were listening to the radio communications. "We'll do our best with what we have," he replied. "But we have 2 children who need advanced life support as soon as possible. Every hour of delay increases the risk of permanent complications or worse." The psychological impact of the rescue situation extended beyond the children to Rebecca herself, who found her emotions overwhelmed by the combination of relief at finding them alive and terror at the possibility of losing them after bringing them so close to safety. Her investment in their survival had become deeply personal, transforming her from a reluctant participant in an emergency situation to someone whose identity was now tied to their successful recovery. The medical crisis reached its peak when Sarah Mitchell went into cardiac arrest just after midnight, her heart stopping as hypothermia-induced chemical imbalances overwhelmed her body's ability to maintain normal rhythm. Frank's immediate response with CPR and emergency medications represented the difference between life and death for the 8-year-old, whose survival would depend on interventions that pushed his emergency medical training to its absolute limits. Resuscitation effort required Rebecca to assist with procedures she had never imagined performing, following Frank's rapid instructions while maintaining composure that the other children desperately needed to see. The sight of their friend receiving emergency medical treatment was traumatic for children who had already endured more stress than most adults experience in a lifetime. "She's back," Frank announced after several minutes of intensive intervention, his voice reflecting the exhaustion and stress of fighting for a child's life with inadequate resources. "But she's not stable. We need professional medical support within the next few hours, or we're going to lose her again." Tommy Rodriguez showed signs of improvement as aggressive rewarming efforts began to reverse some of the hypothermia damage, but his neurological responses remained minimal and concerning. Frank's assessment suggested possible brain injury from prolonged oxygen deprivation, complications that could result in permanent disability even if the boy survived his immediate medical crisis. The improvement in weather conditions just before dawn brought the distant sound of helicopter rotors that represented salvation for children who had balanced on the edge of death throughout the longest night of their young lives. The first medical helicopter carried a flight physician and paramedic team, equipped with advanced life support capabilities that far exceeded anything available at the ranch house. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the flight physician, immediately took command of the medical situation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to treating critical patients in challenging environments. Her assessment of the children's conditions confirmed Frank's diagnoses while providing access to medications and equipment that could address the most immediate threats to their survival. "You did outstanding work with these kids," Dr. Valdez told Frank and Rebecca as her team prepared the most critical patients for helicopter evacuation. "Without your interventions, we'd be looking at multiple fatalities instead of children with good chances for full recovery." The helicopter evacuations were conducted in priority order based on medical necessity, with Sarah Mitchell and Tommy Rodriguez receiving first priority due to their life-threatening conditions. Jessica Chun and Marcus Williams followed on the second flight, their infections and respiratory complications requiring hospital treatment that could not be delayed. Without risking permanent complications, Rebecca found herself reluctant to let the children go, having formed emotional bonds during their crisis that transcended normal relationships between strangers. The children's trust in her had been absolute during their darkest hours, and their departure felt like losing family members rather than completing a rescue mission. Michael Harrison was among the last to be evacuated, his condition having stabilized enough to allow him to remain conscious and communicate during the helicopter flight. His final words to Rebecca reflected the maturity that had kept his group alive through impossible circumstances. "Thank you for not giving up on us. You saved our lives, but more than that, you gave us hope when we didn't think anyone cared. Enough to keep looking." As the final helicopter disappeared over the mountain peaks, carrying the last of the rescued children toward advanced medical care, Rebecca stood in the sudden silence of the ranch house and realized that her life had been permanently changed by the events of the past week. She was no longer a mail-order bride seeking a new beginning in unfamiliar territory. She had become someone whose courage and determination had proven equal to challenges that would define her character for the rest of her life. The news of the successful rescue spread through the Colorado mountain communities with the speed of wildfire. transforming Rebecca Thompson from an unknown mail order bride into a regional hero whose courage had captured the imagination of people throughout the state. Local television stations picked up the story first, followed by national news networks that recognized the human interest appeal of a woman who had risked everything to save children she had never met. The media attention was both overwhelming and uncomfortable for Rebecca, who had never sought publicity and struggled with the characterization of her actions as heroic rather than simply necessary. Reporters camped outside the ranch house for days, seeking interviews and photographs that could capture the dramatic elements of the rescue story for audiences hungry for positive news in an often dark world. Frank proved to be an invaluable ally in managing the media circus, using his decades of experience in the tight-knit mountain community to control access to the ranch while ensuring that the children's privacy was protected during their recovery. His gruff exterior concealed a protective instinct that extended to Rebecca, whom he had come to regard as family rather than the stranger she had been just a week earlier. The first visitors to reach the ranch were not reporters, but families of the rescued children, who made the treacherous journey from Denver as soon as road conditions permitted safe travel. Their arrival brought emotional reunions that tested Rebecca's composure as she witnessed the profound gratitude of parents who had accepted their children's deaths only to receive the miraculous news of their survival. Dr. Margaret Harrison, Michael's mother, was among the first to arrive, her professional composure as a pediatric nurse dissolving into tears when she saw the ranch house where her son's life had been saved. Her embrace of Rebecca was fierce and lasting, accompanied by words that would echo in Rebecca's memory for the rest of her life. "You gave me back my child. I can never repay that debt, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying." The reunion between David and Jessica Chun and their parents revealed the depth of sibling loyalty that had complicated the rescue efforts but also demonstrated the powerful bonds that had helped keep the children motivated during their ordeal. Jessica's father, Dr. James Chun, was a surgeon who understood exactly how close his daughter had come to losing her leg, or her life to the spreading infection that Rebecca and Frank had fought to control. Amanda and Tommy Rodriguez's parents, Maria and Carlos, brought their extended family, including grandparents, aunts, and cousins who had maintained vigil throughout the week-long crisis. Their gratitude was expressed not just in words, but in traditional Mexican cooking that filled the ranch house with aromas that reminded Rebecca of community and belonging in ways she had not experienced since childhood. Sarah and Kevin Mitchell's family represented the kind of tight-knit rural community that Rebecca was beginning to understand characterized the mountain region. Their father, Robert Mitchell, was a rancher himself who recognized the skill and courage required to navigate the dangerous terrain that had claimed so many lives over the years. His respect for Rebecca was evident in his offer to help with any needs she might have as she established her new life in Colorado. The mystery of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance was resolved when a search team found him 3 days after the children's rescue, alive but severely injured in a snow cave he had constructed when caught in the same storm that had stranded the children. His decision to join the original search effort had indeed led him to the emergency cabin, but he had been forced to seek shelter himself when the weather deteriorated beyond safe travel conditions. Thomas's injuries included a broken leg and severe frostbite that required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. But his survival completed the miraculous nature of the rescue story that had captivated regional and national attention. His first meeting with Rebecca took place in the Denver hospital where he was recovering, an encounter that was awkward and emotional as two people who had planned to marry as strangers tried to navigate a relationship that had been transformed by extraordinary circumstances. "I never imagined when I wrote those letters that I was inviting someone who would save children's lives," Thomas said during their first conversation, his voice reflecting both gratitude and uncertainty about their future relationship. "You're not the person I thought I was writing to, and I suspect I'm not the man you expected to meet either." Rebecca's response was honest and thoughtful, reflecting weeks of consideration about her future and her place in the mountain community that had embraced her as one of their own. "You're right that we're not the same people who wrote those letters, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can figure out who we actually are and see if that works better than our original plan." The pragmatic approach to their relationship reflected the practical mindset that had enabled Rebecca to survive the rescue crisis and adapt to challenges that would have overwhelmed someone less resilient. Their courtship, if it could be called that, would proceed slowly and carefully as two people who had been changed by circumstances neither could have anticipated. The Colorado Mountain Rescue Association formally recognized Rebecca's contributions to the successful rescue with a civilian commendation that acknowledged her role in saving 9 lives under extreme conditions. The ceremony was held at the community center in Elk Ridge, attended by rescue professionals, local officials, and hundreds of community members who had followed the story through media coverage and personal connections. Sheriff Patricia Williams, who had coordinated the official search efforts, presented Rebecca with the award while acknowledging the limitations that had prevented professional teams from reaching the children in time. "Sometimes civilians accomplish what trained professionals cannot," Sheriff Williams said during the ceremony. Rebecca Thompson demonstrated that courage and determination can overcome lack of experience when lives are at stake. The recognition ceremony also honored Frank's contributions to the rescue, acknowledging his medical expertise and mountain knowledge that had proven essential to the children's survival. His acceptance speech was brief and characteristic. "All I did was what any neighbor would do. The real hero is the woman who risked her life for children she didn't know because it was the right thing to do." The financial impact of the media attention surprised Rebecca, as donations poured in from across the country to support her transition to mountain life and to establish a fund for emergency rescue equipment in remote areas. The generosity of strangers who had been moved by her story provided resources that would ensure her security, while also creating lasting benefits for the rescue community that had embraced her. Children's Hospital Colorado established the Rebecca Thompson Emergency Response Fund to improve rescue capabilities in remote areas, purchasing specialized equipment and training that could prevent future tragedies. The fund represented a tangible legacy of the rescue that would benefit countless others who might find themselves in similar, desperate circumstances. The individual recovery progress of the 9 children provided ongoing sources of both joy and concern as they worked to overcome the physical and psychological effects of their ordeal. Sarah Mitchell's recovery from cardiac arrest was complete, with no apparent lasting effects from her brush with death. Tommy Rodriguez faced a longer rehabilitation process for neurological complications, but his prognosis was optimistic for eventual full recovery. Jessica Chun's infected leg wound healed successfully after surgical treatment, though she would carry scars that would always remind her of the week that changed her life. Marcus Williams overcame his pneumonia without permanent respiratory damage, his recovery aided by the aggressive early treatment he had received at the ranch house. The 5 children from the first evacuation group showed remarkable resilience in their psychological recovery, though all would benefit from counseling to process the trauma they had experienced. Michael Harrison emerged as an advocate for wilderness safety education, using his experience to help other young people understand the importance of preparation and teamwork in outdoor activities. The broader impact of the rescue story resonated throughout Colorado's mountain communities, where Rebecca's example inspired improvements in emergency preparedness and rescue coordination. Her success in saving the children demonstrated that ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when equipped with basic knowledge and motivated by compassion for others. Rebecca's integration into the Elk Ridge community proceeded with surprising ease as neighbors who had followed her story through media coverage welcomed her as someone who had proven her commitment to their shared values of mutual support and responsibility. The mail-order bride who had arrived seeking a new beginning had instead found a calling that would define her role in the community for decades to come. Her relationship with Thomas Mitchell evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared experience rather than the artificial arrangements that had brought them together. Their eventual marriage would be founded on solid understanding of each other's character rather than the hopeful assumptions that characterized their original correspondence. The ranch house that had served as an emergency medical facility was restored to its intended function as a family home. But it would always carry the memories of the week when ordinary people had accomplished something extraordinary in the service of saving children's lives. 6 months after the rescue, Rebecca stood in the community center of Elk Ridge teaching her third wilderness first aid class to a group of local parents, teachers, and outdoor enthusiasts who had signed up to learn the skills that could save lives in emergency situations. The irony was not lost on her that the woman who had arrived in Colorado with no mountain experience was now considered the region's authority on civilian emergency response in remote areas. The classes had evolved organically from requests by community members who wanted to understand what they could do if faced with similar crisis situations. Rebecca's teaching style combined practical skill development with real-world scenarios drawn from her experience with the children, creating training programs that were both engaging and genuinely useful for mountain residents. The most important thing to remember, Rebecca told her students as they practiced hypothermia treatment techniques, is that you don't need to be a medical professional to save someone's life. You just need to stay calm, follow basic principles, and never give up on someone who's counting on you. Her students included Dr. Sarah Martinez, a family physician who had moved to the mountains for the lifestyle, but recognized the need for enhanced emergency skills in areas where professional help might be hours away. Dr. Martinez had become both a student and a collaborator, helping Rebecca develop medical protocols that were appropriate for civilian use while ensuring that the training met professional standards. Margaret Foster, a retired teacher who had lived in the mountains for 30 years, brought decades of experience working with children in crisis situations. Her insights into child psychology and group management proved invaluable as Rebecca developed programs specifically designed for situations involving young people who might panic or become uncooperative during emergencies. The most dedicated student was 18-year-old Michael Harrison, who had returned to Colorado after completing his senior year of high school with a maturity and sense of purpose that impressed everyone who knew his story. His first-hand experience as a survivor gave weight to his advocacy for emergency preparedness education, and his presence in the classes served as a powerful reminder of why these skills mattered. Michael brings credibility that I could never provide alone, Rebecca explained to Thomas during one of their evening conversations at the ranch. When he talks about keeping younger children calm during a crisis, people listen because they know he's actually done it. His voice carries more authority than mine ever could. Thomas's recovery from his injuries had been slower than expected, requiring multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy that had fundamentally changed his approach to ranch management and life planning. The experience of nearly dying in the mountains had given him a perspective on risk and responsibility that influenced every aspect of his relationship with Rebecca and their shared future. Their wedding had taken place in late spring, a small ceremony attended by the rescued children and their families, along with the close-knit community of neighbors and friends who had supported them through the challenging months of recovery and adjustment. The event was more celebration of survival and community than traditional romantic occasion, reflecting the practical foundation of their relationship. "We're not a conventional couple," Rebecca had said during her wedding vows, "but we've been tested by circumstances that most people never face. We know we can count on each other when it matters most, and that's a better foundation for marriage than romance alone." The ranch had been transformed from a bachelor operation into a working, demonstration farm that showcased sustainable mountain agriculture while serving as a training center for emergency preparedness programs. Rebecca's vision combined Thomas's agricultural expertise with her newfound passion for community education, creating an enterprise that served multiple purposes while generating income sufficient to support their shared goals. The emergency shelter program that Rebecca developed became a model for other mountain communities seeking to improve their disaster preparedness capabilities. The initiative involved identifying and equipping remote cabins and shelters with supplies that could sustain stranded travelers until professional rescue teams could reach them, preventing tragedies like the one that had nearly claimed the 9 children. Federal grants and private donations funded the shelter network expansion, with Rebecca serving as coordinator and primary advocate for the program's implementation throughout Colorado's backcountry areas. Her role required travel to various mountain communities, speaking at public meetings and training local volunteers who would maintain the emergency facilities. The psychological counseling that Rebecca had initially resisted proved essential for processing the complex emotions associated with her transformation from unemployed factory worker to community leader and emergency response educator. Dr. Patricia Winters, a trauma specialist from Denver, provided guidance that helped Rebecca understand the significance of her experience while developing healthy coping mechanisms for the ongoing responsibility she felt for others. Safety. Survivor's responsibility is a real phenomenon, Dr. Winters explained during one of their sessions. When someone saves lives under extraordinary circumstances, they often feel permanently accountable for the welfare of those they rescued and others who might face similar situations. It's admirable but can become overwhelming without proper perspective. The counseling sessions helped Rebecca establish boundaries between her desire to help others and the need to maintain her own emotional health. The balance was delicate, requiring constant attention to ensure that her commitment to emergency preparedness education didn't become an obsession that consumed all other aspects of her life. The children's ongoing recovery provided both inspiration and concern as they navigated the long-term effects of their trauma while returning to normal teenage activities and concerns. Sarah Mitchell had become an advocate for outdoor safety education in her elementary school, sharing her experience with classmates while emphasizing the importance of preparation and adult supervision during wilderness activities. Tommy Rodriguez's neurological recovery exceeded medical expectations, though he continued to experience occasional memory issues that served as reminders of how close he had come to permanent brain damage. His resilience impressed doctors and inspired other children facing similar medical challenges, making him an unofficial spokesperson for pediatric trauma recovery. Jessica Chun had channeled her experience into academic pursuits, developing an interest in emergency medicine that led to her participation in Rebecca's first aid classes despite her young age. Her goal of becoming a trauma surgeon was directly inspired by the medical care she had received during the rescue, creating a career trajectory that might eventually return her to the mountain communities where her life had been saved. Marcus Williams struggled more than the others with long-term psychological effects, experiencing anxiety and panic attacks that required ongoing therapy and medication management. His challenges highlighted the reality that not all trauma survivors recover at the same pace or to the same degree, requiring individualized support that acknowledged different coping capabilities. The relationship between Rebecca and the children had evolved into something resembling an extended family structure, with regular communication and visits that maintained the bonds formed during their shared crisis. Their parents had come to regard Rebecca as an honorary aunt whose role in their children's lives extended far beyond the rescue itself. Holiday gatherings at the ranch became annual, traditions that brought together all 9 families, creating a community of support that transcended the original emergency circumstances. The event served multiple purposes, celebrating the children's continued recovery, maintaining connections between families who might otherwise have drifted apart, and providing opportunities for the children to process their shared experience. With others who truly understood what they had endured, Rebecca's role as hostess for these gatherings satisfied her maternal instincts while allowing her to monitor the children's ongoing development and adjustment. The responsibility was both rewarding and emotionally demanding, requiring her to balance celebration of their survival with acknowledgement of the trauma that had brought them together. The media attention that had initially felt overwhelming gradually decreased as other stories captured public interest. But Rebecca's reputation as an expert in civilian emergency response continued to generate speaking requests and consulting opportunities throughout the Mountain West. Her presentations at emergency preparedness conferences and training seminars helped spread the lessons learned from the children's rescue to communities facing similar challenges. The consulting work provided additional income that supported the ranch's educational programs while allowing Rebecca to influence emergency preparedness policies at state and regional levels. Her testimony before legislative committees helped secure funding for rural rescue training programs and emergency shelter networks that could prevent future tragedies. Frank's role in Rebecca's new life had evolved into something resembling a father figure, providing guidance and support as she navigated challenges that ranged from ranch management to public speaking. His gruff exterior concealed a deep pride in her accomplishments and fierce protectiveness towards someone he had come to regard as family. "You've done something remarkable here," Frank told Rebecca as they surveyed the latest group of first aid students practicing rescue techniques in the ranch's training area. "You've turned personal tragedy into community benefit, and that's not something many people could accomplish." The observation reflected the broader transformation that had occurred not just in Rebecca's life, but in the entire region's approach to emergency preparedness and community responsibility. Her example had inspired others to develop skills and take on responsibilities that could make the difference between life and death when professional help was not immediately available. As winter approached again, bringing the anniversary of the rescue that had changed so many lives, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a desperate woman fleeing poverty in Ohio to a respected community leader whose influence extended throughout Colorado's mountain regions. 2 years after the rescue that had transformed her life, Rebecca found herself standing before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the need for federal funding to support civilian emergency response training in rural areas. Her transformation from a desperate woman seeking marriage to a nationally recognized expert in wilderness survival had culminated in this moment where her voice could influence policy affecting millions of Americans living in remote areas. Congressman Robert Chun, Jessica's uncle who had become an advocate for emergency preparedness legislation following his niece's rescue, had invited Rebecca to share her expertise with lawmakers who struggled to understand the unique challenges facing rural communities. Her testimony would be crucial in securing federal support for programs that could save countless lives in situations similar to the one that had nearly claimed 9 children. "Honorable members of the committee," Rebecca began, her voice steady. "Despite the magnitude of the moment, 2 years ago I was an unemployed factory worker from Ohio who knew nothing about mountain survival. Today I'm here because ordinary citizens can accomplish extraordinary things when they have basic training and the courage to act when others need help." Her presentation combined statistical evidence about rural emergency response times with personal narratives that illustrated why civilian training programs were essential for community safety. The emotional impact of her story, combined with practical policy recommendations, provided lawmakers with both the motivation and the framework needed to support comprehensive emergency preparedness legislation. The hearing room was packed with representatives from rural communities throughout the American West, many of whom had traveled significant distances to support Rebecca's testimony and advocate for their own constituencies. The presence of Dr. Margaret Harrison, Michael's mother, who had become a pediatric emergency medicine specialist, added medical credibility to the civilian perspective that Rebecca represented. Senator Patricia Williams from Colorado, the former sheriff who had coordinated the original search efforts, served as Rebecca's primary advocate within the legislative process. Her law enforcement background provided political credibility that complemented Rebecca's grassroots expertise, creating a powerful coalition that could appeal to lawmakers across party lines. The federal government spends billions on urban emergency response capabilities, Senator Williams argued during the hearing, but rural communities are often left to fend for themselves when disasters strike. Rebecca Thompson's experience demonstrates that we can train ordinary citizens to bridge the gap between crisis and professional response, potentially saving thousands of lives annually. The legislative testimony represented the culmination of 2 years of advocacy work that had taken Rebecca to dozens of communities throughout the Mountain West, training hundreds of civilians in emergency response techniques while documenting the need for systematic support of rural preparedness programs. Her work had evolved from local community education to regional coordination, and finally to national policy advocacy. The National Wilderness Safety Foundation, established with donations generated by media coverage of the children's rescue, had grown into a significant organization with Rebecca serving as executive director. The foundation's programs included emergency shelter maintenance, civilian training coordination, and policy advocacy that addressed gaps in rural emergency response capabilities. Dr. Amanda Foster, an emergency medicine physician who had relocated from Denver to work with Rebecca's programs, served as the foundation's medical director. Her expertise ensured that civilian training programs met professional standards while remaining accessible to people without medical backgrounds. The collaboration between Rebecca's practical experience and Dr. Foster's medical knowledge created training protocols that were both effective and safe. The foundation's work had attracted attention from international organizations dealing with similar challenges in remote areas around the world. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and Norway had visited Colorado to study Rebecca's programs, leading to consulting contracts that helped fund expansion of domestic initiatives while spreading American expertise to other countries facing comparable geographic and logistical challenges. Michael Harrison, now 19 and studying emergency management at Colorado State University, had become Rebecca's primary assistant and eventual successor within the foundation's leadership structure. His unique perspective as both survivor and advocate provided credibility that enhanced the organization's effectiveness in working with young people and their families. Michael represents the next generation of emergency preparedness leaders, Rebecca explained to the Congressional Committee. His experience surviving a wilderness crisis gives him insights that no amount of academic training could provide. When he talks to other young people about safety and preparation, they listen because they know he's actually lived through the situations he's describing. The testimony highlighted the intergenerational impact of the rescue, demonstrating how traumatic events could be transformed into positive influences that rippled through communities and families for years after the original crisis. Michael's career trajectory illustrated the potential for survivors to become advocates, whose work could prevent similar tragedies from affecting others. The congressional hearing also addressed the economic benefits of civilian emergency preparedness training, with Rebecca presenting data showing that communities with trained civilian responders experience significantly lower costs associated with search and rescue operations, medical evacuations, and disaster recovery. The financial arguments proved particularly persuasive with budget-conscious lawmakers who needed to justify federal expenditures to their constituents. Rebecca's personal story provided the emotional foundation for policy arguments, but her presentation emphasized systematic solutions rather than individual heroism. Her goal was to create sustainable programs that could function without depending on extraordinary individuals, willing to risk their lives for strangers. The focus on systematic improvement rather than heroic intervention reflected her maturation as a policy advocate. The children whose rescue had initiated Rebecca's transformation had all progressed significantly in their recovery and development, with several becoming advocates for wilderness safety in their own communities. Jessica Chun, now 16, had established a wilderness safety club at her high school that trained students in basic emergency response techniques, while organizing educational camping trips that emphasized proper preparation and risk management. Tommy Rodriguez had overcome most of his neurological complications and had developed into a talented athlete, whose experience with near death had given him a perspective on competition and achievement that impressed coaches and teammates. His story of survival and recovery inspired other young people facing medical challenges, making him an unofficial spokesperson for pediatric trauma recovery. Sarah Mitchell had channeled her experience into academic pursuits, developing an interest in child psychology that was directly inspired by her observations of how different children had coped with their shared trauma. Her goal of becoming a therapist specializing in childhood trauma represented another example of how the rescue experience had influenced career choices and life trajectories. The broader impact of Rebecca's work extended beyond emergency preparedness into community development and social cohesion in rural areas throughout the Mountain West. Her programs brought together neighbors who might otherwise have limited contact, creating social networks that strengthen communities while enhancing their emergency response capabilities. The training programs had identified and developed leadership capabilities in dozens of rural residents who had emerged as local coordinators and advocates for emergency preparedness. These individuals formed a network of civilian experts who could respond to regional emergencies while maintaining their primary careers and community responsibilities. Rebecca's marriage to Thomas had evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to community service rather than the my way romantic ideal that had originally motivated their correspondence. Their relationship demonstrated that practical compatibility and shared values could create lasting bonds even when the quote, initial foundation was artificial. The ranch had become a regional center for emergency preparedness education, hosting training programs that attracted participants from throughout the Mountain West while serving as a model for sustainable rural development. The combination of agricultural production, educational services, and policy advocacy created a diversified enterprise that supported both their family and their community mission. Thomas's role had evolved from ranch owner to program coordinator, using his knowledge of mountain conditions and local networks to support Rebecca's educational initiatives, while managing the practical aspects of their expanding operation. His recovery from his injuries had been complete, but the experience had fundamentally changed his priorities and approach to life planning. Frank's continued involvement as both mentor and grandfather figure provided stability and wisdom that guided Rebecca through the challenges of rapid organizational growth and increasing public responsibility. His practical perspective kept her grounded while his emotional support gave her confidence to take on responsibilities that sometimes seemed overwhelming. The media attention that had initially felt intrusive had become a valuable tool for promoting emergency preparedness awareness and securing support for policy initiatives. Rebecca's comfort with public speaking and media interviews reflected her growth from a private person into a public advocate whose influence extended far beyond her original mountain community. The upcoming federal legislation that would provide funding for rural emergency preparedness programs represented the potential culmination of 2 years of advocacy work. But Rebecca understood that policy success would create new responsibilities and challenges that would test her leadership capabilities in different ways. As she prepared to return to Colorado after her congressional testimony, Rebecca reflected, on the journey that had brought her from desperation in Ohio to influence in Washington, recognizing that her transformation was still ongoing, and that the children whose lives she had saved continued to shape her understanding of responsibility, community, and purpose. 5 years after stepping off a Greyhound bus in Elk Ridge, as a desperate woman seeking marriage to a stranger, Rebecca stood in the renovated community center that now bore her name, watching as the latest graduating class of civilian emergency responders received their certifications. The Rebecca Thompson Emergency Response Training Center had become the flagship facility for a program that now operated in 17 states and 3 Canadian provinces, training over 15,000 rural residents in skills that had already saved 247 documented lives. The graduation ceremony was attended by families whose lives had been touched by the program's influence, including several who had successfully responded to wilderness emergencies using techniques learned in Rebecca's courses. Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose prompt application of hypothermia treatment had saved 3 lost hikers during a blizzard the previous winter, represented the program's success in creating a network of capable civilian responders throughout the Mountain West and beyond. Among the graduates was Jennifer Walsh, now 21 and completing her nursing degree with specialization in emergency medicine. Her presence in the program represented the full circle of influence that connected the Coastie original rescue to a new generation of professionally trained responders who combined clinical expertise with practical wilderness experience. Jennifer's journey from terrified 14-year-old survivor to confident medical professional embodied the transformative power of trauma when channeled toward helping others. "When I was 14 and trapped in that cabin," Jennifer said during her graduation speech, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and chosen to dedicate her life to preventing others from experiencing similar terror. "I thought survival was about enduring until someone else could save us. Now I understand that survival is about developing the knowledge and courage to save ourselves and others when professional help isn't available." Rebecca didn't just save our lives that week. She taught us that we could save lives too. Her words reflected the philosophical evolution that had occurred within the emergency preparedness community, shifting from dependence on professional rescue services to empowerment of ordinary citizens who could bridge the gap between crisis and professional response. The change represented more than practical training. It embodied a fundamental alteration in how rural communities approached responsibility for their own safety and welfare. Michael Harrison had returned from completing his master's degree in emergency management at George Washington University, bringing federal internship experience and policy expertise that positioned him to assume leadership of the foundation. As Rebecca gradually transitioned toward a more advisory role. At 21, his appointment as executive director represented both continuity of mission and evolution toward new challenges facing rural emergency preparedness in an era of climate change and increasing extreme weather events. "Rebecca saved our lives when we were children," Michael announced during the ceremony, his presence commanding respect from an audience that included governors, federal officials, and international observers. But more importantly, she taught us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the right knowledge and the courage to act. That lesson has shaped everything I've done since, and it will guide this organization as we expand our mission to serve communities facing new challenges from hurricanes, wildfires, and flooding that threaten millions of Americans annually. The federal legislation that Rebecca had advocated for had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, providing $500 million in sustained funding for rural emergency preparedness programs while establishing national standards for civilian training protocols. The success represented validation of grassroots advocacy and demonstration that individual experience could influence policy at the highest levels of government. The Rebecca Thompson Rural Emergency Preparedness Act had become a model for evidence-based legislation that combined personal narrative with systematic policy solutions. Dr. Sarah Chun, Jessica's older sister who had completed medical school and chosen emergency medicine as her specialty, had joined the program as chief medical officer after completing a residency at Denver General Hospital. Her appointment brought professional medical expertise while maintaining the personal connection to the rescue experience that gave the program its emotional foundation and credibility with rural communities. Her research on civilian emergency response effectiveness had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, providing academic validation for community-based emergency preparedness approaches. The impact of the program extended far beyond the original mountain communities where it had begun. Coastal regions in the Carolinas adapted the protocols for hurricane and marine emergencies. Desert communities throughout Arizona and Nevada modified them for heat-related crises, and northern states from Maine to Alaska implemented versions designed for extreme cold conditions. The fundamental principles of civilian emergency response proved applicable across diverse geographic and climatic challenges, with adaptation protocols developed for urban, suburban, and wilderness environments. International recognition had led to program implementation in rural areas of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, where similar geographic isolation created challenges comparable to those found in the American Mountain West. The United Nations had designated Rebecca's organization as a consulting entity for rural emergency preparedness in developing countries, leading to pilot programs in regions of Africa, South America, and Asia where remote communities faced comparable survival challenges. Rebecca's role had evolved from hands-on training coordinator to strategic planner and international spokesperson, a transition that reflected both the program's growth and her own development as a leader whose influence extended far beyond her original expertise. Her speaking schedule included the World Economic Forum, NATO emergency preparedness conferences, and United Nations humanitarian summits, where her experience informed discussions about community resilience and civilian emergency preparedness. In an era of increasing natural disasters, the transformation of the original ranch into the National Emergency Preparedness Institute represented the physical manifestation of how completely Rebecca's life had changed. The 2,000-acre facility hosted training programs, research initiatives, and policy conferences that attracted participants from 6 continents, establishing Colorado as the global center for civilian emergency response innovation. The Institute's annual budget exceeded $25 million, supporting programs that ranged from basic community training to doctoral research in emergency preparedness. Psychology. Thomas's role as facilities director and program coordinator utilized his knowledge of mountain conditions and practical engineering skills while supporting Rebecca's leadership without competing for public attention. Their marriage had grown into a partnership that balanced public service with private satisfaction, demonstrating that relationships built on shared purpose could thrive even under the pressures of significant public responsibility. They had adopted 2 children whose parents had died in wilderness accidents, creating a family that honored both their commitment to emergency preparedness and their desire for domestic happiness. The children whose rescue had initiated the entire transformation had all reached young adulthood with career paths and life choices that reflected the profound impact of their shared experience. Their collective success represented more than individual recovery. It demonstrated the potential for trauma to generate positive change that extended across generations and communities, creating a ripple effect that continued expanding 5 years after the original crisis. Tommy Rodriguez had become a flight paramedic specializing in wilderness emergency medicine, combining his personal experience with professional training to serve rural communities throughout the Mountain West. His career choice represented the direct conversion of survival experience into professional capability that could help others facing similar crises. His helicopter medical team had completed over 800 rescue missions, saving lives in circumstances that reminded him daily of his own miraculous survival. Sarah Mitchell had pursued psychology with focus on childhood trauma recovery, establishing a practice that served families dealing with wilderness accidents and survival situations. Her doctoral dissertation on resilience factors in childhood trauma recovery had become required reading in graduate psychology programs throughout the country. Her work addressed the psychological aspects of emergency response that traditional medical training often overlooked, filling a gap in services available to rural communities dealing with the aftermath of survival situations. Marcus Williams had channeled his experience into outdoor education, becoming a wilderness guide and safety instructor who emphasized emergency preparedness as essential components of outdoor recreation. His programs attracted young people from urban areas who wanted to develop wilderness skills while learning from someone whose survival experience gave credibility to safety instruction. He had established wilderness safety programs in over 200 schools, reaching thousands of students annually with life-saving knowledge. David Chun had followed his sister Jessica into medicine, specializing in orthopedic surgery with focus on wilderness-related injuries. His career represented the translation of personal experience with wilderness trauma into professional expertise that could help others who suffered similar injuries in remote locations. His research on emergency field treatment of fractures had revolutionized wilderness medicine protocols, saving limbs and lives in situations where traditional medical response was unavailable. Jessica Chun had become an emergency room physician at Denver General Hospital while completing advanced training in wilderness medicine. Her experience as both patient and medical professional provided unique insights into trauma treatment that enhanced her effectiveness with wilderness accident victims. She served on the Medical Advisory Board for the National Emergency Preparedness Institute, ensuring that civilian training programs maintained appropriate medical standards. Amanda Rodriguez had become a teacher specializing in outdoor education and emergency preparedness, bringing wilderness safety training into school curricula throughout the Mountain West. Her work ensured that future generations would be better prepared for wilderness emergencies while understanding the importance of preparation and caution in outdoor activities. Her curriculum had been adopted by over 500 school districts, making emergency preparedness education a standard component of public education in rural areas. Kevin Mitchell had pursued engineering with focus on emergency shelter design and wilderness infrastructure, developing improved emergency shelters and communication systems for remote areas. His technical innovations addressed practical challenges that emerged from his personal experience of depending on basic emergency facilities for survival. His company, Mitchell Emergency Systems, had contracts with national parks, forest services, and emergency management agencies throughout North America. The annual reunion of the rescue families had evolved into the International Conference on Rural Emergency Preparedness, attracting over 5,000 participants from around the world. The event combined celebration of the children's continued success with education about current challenges and innovations in civilian emergency response. The conference generated millions of dollars in economic impact for Colorado, while advancing emergency preparedness knowledge that benefited communities globally. Frank's continued presence as advisor and honorary grandfather to the extended rescue family provided continuity and wisdom that grounded the organization's rapid growth in practical experience and common sense. At 82, his influence ensured that expansion never lost connection to the fundamental values of community responsibility and mutual aid that had motivated the original rescue. His memoir, Mountain Wisdom: Lessons from a Lifetime of Rural Emergency Response, had become a bestseller that inspired a new generation of emergency preparedness advocates. The economic impact of the emergency preparedness programs extended beyond their direct safety benefits to include tourism promotion, economic development, and community building that strengthened rural areas throughout the participating regions. Communities with trained civilian responders experienced increased confidence in outdoor recreation promotion, leading to economic benefits that supported the program's continued expansion. Rural tourism had increased by 35% in areas with active emergency preparedness programs, generating billions in economic activity. Rebecca's personal transformation from desperate mail-order bride to internationally recognized leader represented more than individual success. It demonstrated the potential for ordinary people to create extraordinary change when circumstances revealed hidden capabilities and motivated sustained commitment to serving others. Her autobiography, From Desperation to Determination: How 9 Children Changed My Life and Thousands of Others, had spent 18 months on bestseller lists while generating millions in royalties that supported program expansion. The legacy of the 9 Children's Rescue extended far beyond their individual survival to encompass systemic improvements in rural emergency preparedness, policy changes that supported community resilience, and cultural shifts that emphasized civilian responsibility for mutual aid and emergency response. The ripple effects continued expanding 5 years after the original crisis, touching hundreds of thousands of lives and thousands of communities throughout North America and beyond. As Rebecca looked out over the graduation ceremony attendees, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation in an Ohio factory town to leadership of an international movement that empowered ordinary citizens to save lives in extraordinary circumstances. The mail-order bride who had sought security through marriage to a stranger had instead found purpose through service to a community that had become her chosen family, creating impact that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined. During those desperate days when her greatest hope was simply finding a place to belong, the woman who had once believed her life held no significance beyond survival had discovered that individual courage, when combined with community support and systematic training, could create lasting change that honored both those who were saved and those who chose to dedicate their lives to saving others. Her transformation was complete, but her mission continued with each new graduate who carried her example into communities where their knowledge might mean the difference between tragedy and survival, ensuring that her legacy would continue expanding. For generations to come, the circle that had begun with 9 children trapped in a buried cabin had expanded to encompass thousands of trained civilians, hundreds of communities, and an international policy framework that recognized the essential role of ordinary citizens in protecting their neighbors when professional help was beyond reach. Rebecca Thompson had found her calling not in the marriage she had originally sought, but in the global family she had created through service to others in their darkest hours, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the most desperate circumstances and the courage to help others when help seems impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.